I think something that was less obvious to me at the beginning of this project, but is now like a thing that I keep really coming back to, is that whether something is accurate or not is not a binary, well, this is true or it's false, and that's great. And it's not even a trinary, well, it's true or it's misleading or it's false, but it exists on a continuum. And so it's important when you're thinking about evaluating stories to think about it in that kind of continuous way.
Today, he's going to speak to us on understanding and reducing the spread of misinformation online. I normally would give you an overview of the talk, but it's actually an amalgamation of a variety of different studies that constitute different interventions against misinformation and so-called fake news on social media. So please join me in welcoming David Rain.
It's really great to be here. I'm excited about being back in Boston, and this is one element of that, is being able to connect to Shorenstein and all the great stuff happening around the Kennedy School. So before I start, I just want to say that everything that I'm presenting today is joint work with Gord Pennycook, who is my very close collaborator on all things misinformation, and he's really, really excellent. Okay, and the other thing that I want to say is start with a little bit of definition, because when people use some of these terms, they mean different things by them. And so when I say fake news or false news, I'm not talking about anything that I disagree with, which is one popular definition. But I'm saying specifically, I'm talking about entirely fabricated stories that are presented as if they're true. And I think that this is one form of misinformation that has received the lion's share of attention because it's the most striking, and it's also sort of the easiest to define in some sense. But I actually think it's probably not the most important. There's also what we call hyperpartisan news. So this is sort of biased or misleading coverage of events that did actually happen. And my guess is that hyperpartisan content is both much more widespread, but also probably more pernicious because it's sort of less obviously false. And so the question that I'm interested in is what can we do to fight misinformation of all varieties? And in our research, we do sort of basic science questions about what affects how people relate to misinformation, and then we also do sort of evaluation of different interventions to try and reduce it. And I'm in this talk going to focus on the intervention half of the work. And I'm going to start with the thing that maybe is the thing that comes most easily to mind, and that was one of the first things that social media platforms started doing after the 2016 election, when suddenly everybody was worried about misinformation on social media, which is you can take a post like this that's false, and you can put a warning on it that says something like disputed by third-party fact checkers. Now, there are a lot of problems with this, I think. Some of them are just basic user interface things, like nobody is going to pay attention to that or understand what it means. This is very subtle. But I think that there's a much more fundamental problem, which is even if this was done in a really effective way, it's just not scalable. Like, there's no way that professional fact checkers can keep up with the volume of misinformation that's being produced. And so what that means is, on the one hand, many or even probably most false stories never wind up getting flagged. And even the ones that do, the process is slow. So during the sort of peak virality spreading period, they're not going to be flagged. And so that just sort of immediately limits the amount of impact that an intervention like this can have. But it's actually somewhat worse than that. We identified this thing we called the implied truth effect, where we said, well, imagine what happens in the context where you see content, some of the false content is flagged with warnings, but other false content is missed. And so we did some experiments, one of which I'll show here, where we had about 1,600 Americans. We showed them a series of headlines, some false, some true, some left-leaning, some right-leaning. And then the control condition, that was it. We just asked for each one, would you consider sharing this on social media or not? And of the false headlines, they were willing to share a little less than 30% of them. And so then what happened in the treatment is we put warnings on 3/4 of the false stories. And we did it in a sort of much a more serious way than the little disputed by third-party fact-checker label to sort of give the intervention the best chance that it had. So this big false stamped over things that are false. And what we saw is that for stories that had the warning on them, people were substantially less likely to say they would share them. Cut in half, and we didn't see any kind of evidence of motivated reasoning or reactance where people, if it was content that was aligned with their ideology, the warning made them like it more. We didn't see anything like that. It was just like, great, things that got a warning on them, a lot less likely to be shared. But then the question was, what happened to the fraction of false stories that didn't have warnings on them, the ones that were sort of modeling the situation of these are the ones the fact checkers mixed? And what we find is that there's a significant increase in the probability of sharing the ones that are not labeled. And this implied truth effect, the idea being that the absence of a warning implies that it may have been checked and validated. And it was about a third of the size of the warning effect. And so to the extent that those effect sizes generalize, you could think something like if they're missing more than a third of the stories, they may actually be increasing belief in false content rather than decreasing it. So I think that the warnings are not the best approach. Another thing that got a lot of attention is, and that some platforms have implemented and also that a lot of civil society organizations have been advocating for, is emphasizing the sources. So like, for example, on Facebook, it does show you the source from which the article comes, but in the way that's sort of maximally designed for you not to notice, right? So small light gray letters in the lower corner. And so what we wanted to know is what happens if you put a big banner for the source website or the publisher across the bottom. And the intuition is part of the reason people believe misinformation is they don't notice that it's from a bad source. And if they were to notice it was from a bad source, then they would say, oh, whoops, okay, I guess I shouldn't believe this. And so in a first study to test this, we recruited about 2,000 Americans. We again showed them a set of headlines, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning. And in the control condition, we just presented the source information as usual on Facebook, and then the logo condition, we did the big logo across the bottom. And this is like the fraction of headlines that people judged to be accurate. What we found was completely no effect. So whether it was the control or the logo had basically no influence on their probability of believing either the false or the true headlines. And then we have some other data where we looked at what happens if we completely remove the source information. Also totally no effect. And we were quite sort of taken aback by this. And so we wanted to understand what was going on. And we thought about it. And we realized, well, what should the effect of revealing the source or emphasizing the source be? Just kind of conceptually. And you could sort of imagine it in this space of like, how much, how reputable of an outlet is it? And then how accurate does the headline seem if you don't know the source? Sort of if you're not thinking about the source. And so we do this experiment where we show people the source. We show people articles or headlines without knowing what the source is, and we show people the sources without any specific articles. And we sort of see how plausible the headlines are and how much the sources are trusted. And what sort of conceptually makes sense, and what we in fact see in these experiments, is when there's a mismatch between the plausibility and the source reliability, you get an effect. So if it's a headline that seems plausible, but it's from a distrusted outlet, then emphasizing the source makes people trust it a bit less. And I think this is what sort of people had in mind when they were envisioning this intervention. And similarly, if it seems implausible, but it's from a trusted source, then people trust it more. But if it's in this kind of middle space where there's no mismatch and the trustworthiness of the source is sort of aligned with the plausibility of the headline, then emphasizing the source doesn't do anything because it just kind of confirms what you already would have thought about the headline before you knew the source. And so what we sort of conjectured was maybe most of the headlines are kind of in this middle region where you're not actually getting any additional information. And in fact, the 24 headlines that we used in the study I showed you a second ago, where emphasizing the source didn't do anything, they were all sort of along this diagonal. And so we wanted to know how representative that was of the general sort of social media ecosystem. So what we did is we took a list of 60 sources, some mainstream, some hyperpartisan, some fake news, and we pulled the 10 best performing, like sort of highest engagement articles from each of those sources over the prior year. And then we had people assess either how much they trusted the outlets or how plausible they thought the headlines were when they didn't know the source. And we did it with Americans recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a totally not representative but very easy to get sample. Well, more representative than undergrads, but you know. And then we also used Lucid, which gives a sample that's quota matched to the US on age, gender, ethnicity, and geographic region. And so what we found is that in both cases, the vast majority of the articles were sort of along this diagonal where the trust placed in the source is matched with the plausibility of the headline. So like just learning the source doesn't provide any extra information for everything in this region. And so we actually would expect emphasizing source not to do anything for most of those articles. But what you also see is there's nothing in here like an outlet that is trusted basically never produce headlines that seem implausible, which is an interesting thing, and presumably is part of how outlets come to get to be trusted is by not producing crazy seeming headlines. And I think it's also maybe a bit of a lesson to mainstream outlets that are getting sort of tempted into making clickbaity headlines, that there may be some negative consequences of that. But there are actually a good chunk of headlines in this region where they seem plausible, but they're from sources that people don't trust. So their emphasizing source could actually make people believe those headlines less, and so maybe this would actually be okay. But then what we did is we went and we manually fact-checked the sort of 100-ish articles in that section, and with a sort of very strict truth criteria where we said, if any of the claims in the headline and lead were at all false, we'd call the whole thing false. And even with that sort of conservative criteria, the stuff up here was predominantly true, like more than twice as likely to be demonstrably true as even partially false. And so, that means low quality outlets produce a whole range of content. And so if you were to emphasize the outlet there, that would overall be actually making people's beliefs less accurate, because it would mostly be making them discount the true stuff that the bad outlets made rather than helping them identify the bad content. So I think that also the emphasizing sources is not like the most promising approach. And now what I'm going to take the rest of the time to talk about is a couple of alternatives that we've been exploring that I think seem more promising. And for the first one, we're going to sort of start by taking a more sort of cognitive science approach to try and understand what is it that drives people to share misinformation in the first place. And if we have an understanding of that, that will guide us into what are interventions that might actually work. So the simplest answer to the question of why do people share misinformation is that they just can't tell what's true and what's not true. And so if people are not smart enough to know what's going on or not sort of sufficiently digitally literate to figure out what's going on, then that would be a simple explanation. And so to get some insight into that question, we ran a study where we got about 1,000 Americans from Mechanical Turk. Again, we showed them a set of headlines, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning. And for half of them, in the accuracy condition, underneath each article, we said, to the best of your knowledge, is the claim in the above headline accurate? Yes or no? And one important thing I should say is that in all of our studies, all of the headlines that we use are actual headlines from social media. We're not making up our own fake news, but we're using all real fake news, if you will. Which I think is actually a super important methodological point, because the media ecosystem selects for particular kinds of content in ways that we don't really understand, but are profound. And so the kind of stories that I would make up would be very unlikely to do well on social media, just because most stories are unlikely to do well. And so to the extent that you want to understand how people interact with the content that is happening out there in the world, it's important to really study that content. Anyways, okay, so half the people get asked, is it accurate, yes or no? And the other half of the people get asked, would you consider sharing this story online, for example, through Facebook or Twitter? And in the studies, we also sort of asked them at the beginning, would you ever consider sharing political content on social media? And the people that say no, we just kind of get rid of them so we get a better signal, although it doesn't actually make that much difference. Okay, so now the question is the fact that is there some difference between their accuracy judgments and their sharing judgments or not? And so if we start with accuracy, if the question is, can they just not tell what's true versus false? And I guess in particular, you might think that what they can tell is whether things align with their ideology or not. I'm going to show you the fraction of headlines that people said were accurate based on whether they were false or true, and whether they were discordant or concordant with the person's ideology. And what you see is that when you ask about accuracy, the results are actually pretty encouraging, where people rate the true stories as vastly more accurate than the false stories, regardless of whether they align with their ideology. And the sort of effect of aligning of ideology is really quite small. So this suggests that when people are actually trying to evaluate the accuracy of content, they're reasonably good at it, and they're not that swayed by politically motivated reasoning or partisan bias or anything like that. When you look at sharing, on the other hand, so here I'm showing you the same plot, but this is the fraction of stories people said that they would consider sharing rather than that they thought were accurate. And when you look at sharing, the pattern is strikingly different, where there's essentially no difference between false and true, and people are much more willing to consider sharing things that align with their ideology than ones that don't. And the comparison that is particularly striking is for the politically concordant but false statements, where they're about twice as likely to say they would consider sharing it as they are to say that it's true. I think that this suggests that the problem is not that people simply can't tell what's false or not false. And so then what might it be? I think the most natural conclusion that might first come to mind when you look at those data is, that we're in this post-truth world, and although people can tell what's accurate or not, they just don't care much about accuracy. And so how partisan something is more important to them when deciding what to share than what's accurate. And so they might say to themselves, I know that this is false, but I like it, it aligns with my view of the world, so I'm going to share it anyways. And so to get a preliminary piece of evidence into whether that is an accurate way of characterizing people's motivations, we just asked them, when deciding whether to share a piece of content on social media, how important is it to you that the content is surprising, politically aligned, funny, interesting, or accurate? And we randomized the order across people. And so if people really didn't care about accuracy and were willing to tell us that, which obviously is a caveat with these particular data that we'll get back to in a minute, but you might expect, based on the pattern of sharing that we saw in the previous slide, that people are going to think sharing politically aligned stuff is a lot more important than showing accurate stuff. But the results are quite strikingly not consistent with that, where people say accuracy is way more important than basically everything else. And they say that political alignment is really overall not very important. And 80% of the subjects said that had no dimension that they thought was more important than accuracy. And so this suggests that in terms of people's explicitly held values, people do tend to think that accuracy is an important thing when they're making sharing decisions. Now, like I said, one possibility is that people are just lying. But if we put that possibility in contrast with an alternative possibility, which is maybe that people do actually care a lot about accuracy, but the context of social media is basically distracting them, and it's focusing their attention on other things that they care about. And so like in this space, say that you're someone that cares a lot about accuracy and a bit about political alignment and humor or something like that. Then if you thought about all the different attributes, you would say, well, this false but sort of politically aligned content, it's false, so I should not share it. But our sort of idea is that people have constrained, we have cognitive constraints. We can't consider everything at the same time. And the context does a lot of determining what we pay attention to versus don't pay attention to. And so the idea is that in the social media context in particular kind of shines the attentional spotlight on things like partisan alignment and humor and surprisingness and away from accuracy. And so people essentially forget to consider accuracy when they're making their sharing decisions, but if they were just kind of reminded of accuracy and so they got that into their consideration set, they would say, oh, actually, if it's false, I don't want to share it. And the reason that we think that social media is particularly distracting from accuracy is there are all these other things that are really at the core of the social media experience, things like social validation and reinforcement, the desire to attract more followers, the idea to signal things about yourself to all of the people out there that are listening to you. And there are aspects of the platform design that in particular make these things salient by giving you immediate quantitative feedback on how much people liked it, and putting you in a sort of echo chamber situation where you're getting lots of positive feedback, and also you get selective feedback, because in general, people that agree with you are much more likely to say, yeah, awesome, than the people that disagree with you. I mean, some of them will get upset and yell at you, but a lot of people are just like, okay, whatever. And so it creates this kind of biased feedback system that focuses people on these things that are not accuracy. And so if that's true, then the prediction that this account makes is if you just kind of make the concept of accuracy more salient to people, make it more top of mind, then they'll be more likely to take it into account when they're deciding what to share. And so to test this idea, we did we started with some survey experiments. And so in the design of these experiments, we start where we show people the same thing as in all the other experiments I've showed you before. Here's this headline. If you were going to see it on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? And that's the control condition. And in the control condition, we see that people are only slightly more likely to say they would share true headlines compared to false headlines. Again, consistent with what I have showed you before. And then what the treatment is everything is exactly the same, but at the beginning of the study, before they know anything about what the main study is about, we say, hey, before you start, can you do us a favor and help us pre-test one item for another study that we're running that's about accuracy? We just show them like one, let's see, where did that go? Yeah, we show them this like one politically neutral headline and say, in your opinion, is the above headline accurate? And then we say, okay, thanks, now you're done, go on to the main task. And so the point is, we didn't tell them accuracy is important, please try and be more accurate, don't share fake news is not your friend, whatever, blah, 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 right? We just like made the concept of accuracy activated in their mind, such that they went on to do exactly the same sharing task. They were more likely to be thinking about accuracy, sort of the attentional spotlight was swung in the direction of accuracy. And so as a result, they were significantly less likely to say that they would consider sharing false content, but not true content. And so that translates into like a 20% decrease in the fraction of false stories they say they were willing to share, and more than tripling the difference in sharing probability of true versus false, which is what we call discernment. So that was the sort of first study that we did on this. It works both for headlines that align with your ideology and headlines that don't. It works for Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't change people's answers to the question about how important accuracy is, so that suggests it's not sort of manufacturing an accuracy motive, it's just getting people to pay attention to this concept. We replicated it with a different set of headlines, so it wasn't unique to the particular ones that we used in that first study, and we replicated it in a more representative sample using Lucid, so it's not something funny about M-Turkers. And we also did it in the Lucid study, we did an active control where we have people rate at the beginning, instead of how accurate do you think this headline is, we say, how funny do you think this headline is? And that doesn't do anything. So it's not that just getting people to rate headlines makes them more discerning. It's specifically getting them to think about accuracy. So we were sort of happy about those results, but it's these survey experiments are only so compelling, particularly in the context of sharing, where we want to know, does this work actually in the wild, where people are making real sharing decisions? And so it's maybe not just about them wanting to look good to us. And also, as I said at the beginning, I think a real challenge here is not just blatantly false stuff, but also misleading stuff. So we want to know, does this work beyond just totally fake news? And so what we did next in this project is we did a field experiment where we wanted to know, does sending someone a direct message on Twitter about the concept of accuracy get them to actually improve the quality of what they share? And so the way that we did this is we created a bunch of Twitter accounts. We made these 12 cooking bot accounts. And we were sort of trying to simulate something that would be as in the general vein of what the experience would be like if the social media platform was to implement this. So we wanted them to know that this question that we sent them is not coming from some person. It's just some kind of like automated account, whatever. So with Cooking Bot says, I'm a bot that shares and retweets awesome stories about food and famous chefs. We thought the idea was, OK, it's not political, so we're trying to not get people to be defensive, but just say, oh, here's some random thing. What about it? OK, so we got our bot accounts, and then we found about 136,000 people that had retweeted a link to either Breitbart or InfoWars in the preceding few months. And we focused on those sites because prior work, including by people here, have suggested that in this current moment in the social media ecosystem, people on the right are much more likely to be sharing sort of low-quality content, so it would give a higher signal. And one might also worry that it might be sort of less receptive to accuracy cues. So we're sort of trying to set ourselves up with a hard test case here. So we followed 136,000 Breitbart retweeters. We got about 11,000 of them followed us back, just kind of for whatever reason. And our evidence suggests that the people that follow us back are the kind of spammier end of Twitter. Like they do worse on the bot or not, like bot detection thing. And so there were, again, these people are like the set of people, even from within this set, the subset that follow us back are the ones that I would think of as less likely to respond to our treatment. And we did our best to weed out ones that really looked like bots. So we threw out accounts that did above 0.5 on this bot or not algorithm in some waves of it. And for other people, we threw out high frequency tweeters as an approach to like rule out either bots or people that were like political operatives who we also wouldn't expect to respond to this because they're not making a mistake, like they know what they're doing. Okay, so we wind up with our total of like 5,400-ish users. And what we did is now that there are followers, we can send them private direct messages. And so we sent each person a direct message that's basically the exact same thing from the survey experiment, where it says, how accurate is this headline? Here's some random headline. And it says, hey, thanks for following me. Can I ask you for a favor? I'm wondering how accurate the above headline is, and I'm doing a survey to find out, based on the headline, how accurate do you think it is? And basically, nobody responds. And basically, nobody clicks on the survey. But that's fine, because the point was just, as long as they opened the thing and read the top line, then they're treated. That's sort of enough to like activate this concept of accuracy. And then we want to know, what effect does this have on their subsequent tweeting? And in order to do causal inference and say, like, what is the actual effect of this, we used a stepped wedge experimental design where everybody receives the treatment, but people are randomly assigned to the day on which they get messaged. And so that means the people that get randomly assigned to be treated on day one, on day one, they are the treatment, and everybody that hasn't gotten the message yet is the control. Then on day two, these guys are the treatment, and they're the control. And so we basically have like a mini experiment on each day, and then except for the last day, because there's no control to compare them to, whatever. And then you basically can do the comparison of what's the quality of the stuff tweeted by the people in the treatment days versus the control days. And we just look at the 24-hour chunk after the message is sent, because that's the sort of periodicity with which we were sending the messages. So basically, this is the proof of concept to say, does it work? And then if it does work, we can look at things like how does it decay and how do you make it more effective and so on. But so the question then is, what is the quality of the news shared during the 24 hours after receiving the DM compared to the people in that same chunk of time that didn't get the DM? And in order to do that, we need some way of quantifying the quality of the news. And so the way we did it is we selected a set of 60 sites, so 20 mainstream outlets that we took from a Pew list of the top news providers, online news providers in the US. As you'll see on the next list, some of these are not the best, but they are mainstream. And as we'll see, they're better than the other ones. Where we got also 20 hyperpartisan outlets and 20 fake news outlets, where we got put together lists assembled by other people of hyperpartisan sites and lists of fake news sites. And we say something counts as a hyperpartisan site if it's on at least 2 hyperpartisan lists. It counts as a fake news site if it's on at least 2 fake news sites. And then we picked the ones from each of those collections of sources that had the largest number of unique links on Twitter. So we're basically trying to pick out what are the most important outlets in each of these categories. And so here are the 60 outlets that we wind up with. The mainstream ones have things like New York Times and Washington Post, and then also Fox, and then also things like Daily Mail. But okay. Then the hyperpartisan one have left-leaning things like Daily Cross and Crooks and Liars, right-leaning things. Then we also included Breitbart and InfoWars because they were ones that we found people were particularly familiar with, even though the actual volume of Twitter URLs wasn't as high as some of these other ones. And then the fake news sites, you've probably never heard of any of them because they're just weird random sites. And then what we did is we had this 60 set of sites rated by 8 professional fact checkers to indicate how much do you trust each of these sites. And this is going to be our quality score, is what's the sort of fact checker trustworthiness rating of the sources that you are tweeting. And just to see what this distribution looks like, this is, New York Times and Washington Post are here. Let's see, Fox is here. Breitbart is here. InfoWars is down here. All the random ones you've never heard of are down there. And so one observation is there's a lot of variation within the mainstream category, but essentially everything in the hyperpartisan and fake news categories are not getting trusted. And I've set the 0 point here at the average quality of links shared by the users in our experiment. So that means these aren't guys that one time tweeted a Breitbart link by accident and then went back to tweeting the New York Times all the time. These are the people who are on average worse than their average tweet is worse than any mainstream tweet in terms of the fact checker quality ratings. So we sort of successfully isolated people that are sharing substantial amounts of low quality content. Okay, so the big question then is, what was the effect of getting our message on the content that they tweet? And one way that I'm going to sort of represent this for you is I'm going to sort of, at the level of the domain, there's going to be 1 dot for each of the different news sources in our list that people shared. And the size of the dot is going to be proportional to how frequently it was shared in the control, the sort of before they got the treatment. And then on the x-axis, there'll be how much the fact checker said it was trustworthy. And on the y-axis, we'll have how much the frequency of that outlet changed after getting the DM. So how the fraction of the person's total tweets of total to these rated sites was made up by that news site. And so what you see is that the receiving that are one random little message about how accurate is this random political headline increased the fraction of tweets from these Breitbart retweeters that were to New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, and Fox News, and decreased the amount to Daily Caller, Breitbart, Daily Wire, Western Journal. And I know that Fox News is, maybe a border case here, but when you look at the things that are to foxnews.com, that's mostly links to the news side of Fox News and not so much to the talking head sort of opinion side of Fox News. And so I think that I would definitely prefer people to be reading Fox than Breitbart, although I'm curious if other people agree. But anyway, so the treatment had the effect that we were hoping for. You could quantitate it if you split things into number of tweets to mainstream versus hyperpartisan or fake news sites. The treatment doubles the difference between fake and hyperpartisan versus mainstream sites. And if you look at just the average quality among users that actually tweeted, and therefore who we can measure their quality, it was about a 5% increase in the average quality of the content shared. And because the social media data is way more complicated than a survey experiment, there's many, many different ways you could choose to analyze this. And so just to show that the results are robust, we tried like 96 different analytic approaches where you vary what's the outcome measure, what's the model that you're using, how do you calculate significance, a whole bunch of different dimensions, like which tweets do you include or not include. And you see that overwhelmingly, this is our magical p less than 0.05 threshold. Basically, they're like overwhelmingly the whatever analysis you choose in general is showing evidence of an effect. So I think that this is a proof of concept that this kind of approach could really be helpful, and it's something that I think platforms could very easily implement. Where for in one version of it, while you're scrolling through your newsfeed, and forgive my my expertise is in running experiments, not doing clip art and graphic design. So this is my very hacky mock-up. But you could be while you're scrolling through, a little thing pops up that basically says, help us inform our algorithms. How accurate is this headline? And you're going to say inaccurate, accurate, and then keep going. And so, and from the perspective of this intervention, it's just asking the question that's important. You can throw away the responses, but just by asking them, it gets people to be thinking more about accuracy. And so, if this works, it could provide a sort of distributed solution to help reduce the spread of fake news that doesn't require some kind of centralized definition of what's true or what's false that you then censor. But instead, it relies on people's own ability to tell what's accurate if they bother to think about it, and their own desire to not share inaccurate content if they're thinking about accuracy. And it's also scalable in that because each person is kind of doing it to themselves, you don't need an army of fact checkers. Now, there's clearly a lot of room to optimize this effect in terms of the size of the treatment effect. That thing that we did is just the first random thing that popped into my head. And so we're doing some work now with Jigsaw, the sort of Google's R&D unit, to try and figure out ways to optimize that treatment effect. Another thing that's cool about this is it's something that platforms could do themselves, and I think that that would be really, really good. But in the absence, or let's say in the interim, until we manage to convince them to do it, it's also something that could potentially be deployed using ads by sort of any citizen group that felt like it, could buy ads on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, targeted at people who they think are likely to be sharing misinformation, and do these accuracy reminders. And so we're also working with some people from the Omidyar network to test delivering this intervention using targeted ads. And of course, the challenge with this is it might work once, but it could pretty quickly, people start just ignoring the messages. So that's one thing that sort of needs to get worked on, is how do you sort of avoid banner blindness and get it so people are still engaging with the content. But I think that's a sort of tractable UX problem that just sort of needs to get worked out. I'd say it again, this is basically, we did a proof of concept, and now we hope that the tech companies or people that are sort of good at that thing will get inspired by this and try and actually implement it. All right, so that's promising intervention number 1. And then it sort of connects to promising intervention number 2, which is when I proposed my little pop-up help us inform our algorithms. I said you could just throw away the responses and this would still be helpful because it would get people thinking about accuracy. But the other question is, well, should we throw away the responses, or might the people's responses actually also be useful? That is, can you get lay people to help make fact-checking or quality assessing scalable by crowdsourcing it, rather than just relying on experts? And this was something that we originally got interested in because a couple of years ago, Facebook said that they were going to start doing exactly this, that they were going to start surveying users to determine which news sources were trustworthy, and then upranking content from those sources. And the idea is that if it works, the way that you would do it is it's not like you can just click, it's not like Reddit where you can up or down vote sources, because that is sort of fairly easily gamed through coordinated attacks and stuff like that. But the idea is rather you just randomly sample people to say, hey, give us your opinion. What do you think? What do you think of these outlets? And then you would use the outputs from the crowdsourcing as inputs into the ranking algorithm to say if it's something that people say is not trustworthy, then downrank it and make it so people are less likely to see it. And so that also means it's not necessarily about labeling. You don't have to rely on people paying attention to the ratings. You just sort of use them as the input into the ranking algorithm. Of course, this is censoring, right? We're talking about censoring the things that people say are not true. So like that is something to be wrestled with. From my perspective, inherent in almost any of the solutions to social media is a trade-off between the amount of censoring that's going on and the amount of misinformation that's circulating. And so to me, the question here is, at least, does this help on the misinformation side? And if it does, then you can have a conversation about the extent to which you think that that's worth it on the censoring side. And if it worked, it would be scalable, because again, you don't need to rely on experts. You can recruit large numbers of just regular old people to do it. And it at least doesn't rely on Facebook deciding what to censor, but it's letting the people decide what to censor. OK, so this is sort of the argument for why it's a good idea. And then when Facebook said they were going to start doing this, everybody freaked out. I was like, this is the worst idea I've ever heard, because, and including me, so actually the way this whole project started is a journalist called me in January 2018 and said, hey, Facebook just said they're going to start doing this. What do you think about it? And I was like, well, sounds like a pretty bad idea, because probably lay people's trust judgments are very influenced by partisanship, and people are probably going to say they trust the most partisan sites, not the sites that are most accurate. Also, people are probably not very good at assessing the accuracy of content, which is why we have a problem in the first place. And also, people are probably not familiar with most of the outlets involved, and sort of levels of media literacy are pretty low. So why should we expect lay people to be able to do a good job at this? And so I said all those things, and then I was like, but now that I think about it, this is actually a very simple empirical question. Like, why don't we just test it? And so that night, Gord and I put together a survey. We got our list of 60 news outlets, recruited 1,000 people, had them rate the answers. And then what I'm going to show you here is a follow-up that we did that is better than the original one, although the results are essentially identical. So what we did is we showed them that same set of 60 news outlets that I showed you before, the 20 mainstream, 20 hyperpartisan, 20 fake news. And we asked, are you familiar with each of these outlets, and how much do you trust each of these outlets? And then, we used Lucid, so these were Americans that were quota sampled to be representative on age, gender, ethnicity, and geographic region. And what I'm going to show you is 1 point per news outlet, showing the average trust among the Democrats on the x-axis and the average trust among the Republicans on the y-axis. So up here is trusted by both, down here is distrusted by both, over here is trusted more by Democrats than Republicans, and up here is trusted more by Republicans than Democrats. And remember, the fear going into this is that people are going to trust the low-quality outlets that align with their ideology more than the high-quality outlets that don't, or at least one fear. And so what we found sort of, I guess to our surprise, here's the pattern. I labeled all the mainstream ones and the hyperpartisan ones that more than a third of the people said they were familiar with. And so what you see is, first of all, there are some clear partisan differences. Like the Republicans trust Fox way more than they trust everything else. And the Democrats trust literally every other mainstream outlet more than Republicans. But to us, the thing that was really striking here is that these partisan differences are actually the second order effect. And the first order difference is everybody trusts the mainstream outlets more than the hyperpartisan or fake outlets. And so that means, for example, although the Republicans trust Fox more than CNN, New York Times, NBC, they trust CNN, New York Times, NBC more than they trust Breitbart or InfoWars. And similarly, although the Democrats trust Fox News less than they trust all of the other mainstream outlets, more or less, they trust Fox News more than they trust things like Daily Kos or Common Dreams, the sort of left-leaning hyperpartisan sites. And so what that means is that if you were to create a sort of a politically balanced layperson rating or a representative layperson rating, every mainstream outlet would do better than every fake or hyperpartisan outlet. And then because we also had these 8 professional fact checkers rate this set of 60 sites, we can also say, let's make a politically balanced layperson rating and say, how does the politically balanced layperson rating correlate with the rating from the fact checkers? And what we found was a correlation of 0.9, which is the largest correlation that I've ever observed in anything I've ever done in my life. The thing that's driving that really high correlation is that, and I guess another important point here is if what we're talking about is using these ratings to generate inputs to the ranking algorithm, then the only thing that matters is the relative rank. Like it doesn't matter if all of the trust levels are low or all of the trust levels are high. You're just saying relative to each other, you know, what's the spread like and what's the ordering like. And so although you see the fact checkers are sort of using the whole scale from really trusted a lot to really not trusted at all, and the lay people are only going from trusted somewhat to trusted barely, the ranking is pretty similar because all of the fake and hyperpartisan sites get really low trust ratings from Republicans, Democrats, and fact checkers. There's much less agreement within the mainstream category. Basically, people can't agree on what's good, but they can agree on what's bad, basically. And so this suggests that if your goal was reduce circulation from misinformation sites, and you wanted to do it in a way that was sort of politically defensible, so people couldn't complain that, oh, you're picking, you know, you liberal, wherever, are picking which sites to censor, which is what a lot of the right-wing sites did after Facebook started doing this. You can say, look, we just survey the people, and the people say these sites are not good, and we downrank them. So, and this suggests this would be reasonably effective at that. And in particular, this suggests that the partisan element in these trust judgments is a lot smaller than what I might have expected at the beginning. But the thing is, there is a problem here, which is that when we also ask them, are you familiar with each outlet or not? And if you split the ratings based on whether people said they were unfamiliar or they were familiar, so it's going to be like the fraction of ratings that were not at all trust, barely trust, somewhat trust, a lot trust, entirely trust, based on whether they were unfamiliar with the site or familiar. And what you see is that for sites that they were unfamiliar with, in purple, people overwhelmingly distrust them. Whereas for sites that they are familiar with, there's a whole range, they're making a judgment based on whatever they know about it. And so what that means is that if you implement a system like this, it basically punishes unfamiliar sites. And so if you are a niche site or you're a new site, you're going to get smashed by this. So that's not great. You might think one approach to that is, well, just restrict to people who said that they're familiar with it, which is actually what Facebook said they were going to do when they were implementing this, although who knows what they actually did, because those two things are not that related to each other. And so they said, well, we're only going to look at the ratings from people that say they're familiar. So now I'm going to show you the same plot of one dot per outlet Democrats versus Republicans, but only using ratings from people that people said that they were familiar with the outlets. And it's terrible. So this might be surprising because you might think, well, these are the more informed people. But if you think about it, there's a selection problem because who is it that selects into being familiar with hyperpartisan sites? It's people that like hyperpartisan content. And who selects into being familiar with fake news sites? It's people that like fake news sites. So that's not a good solution to this problem. What this led us to is, so one limitation is what I said, which is that familiarity is a prerequisite for trust, and so it punishes niche outlets. Another issue is, as we saw in those earlier study, the site is a coarse level of graining because low quality sites produce a whole range of content. So if you're doing this sort of censoring essentially at the level of the site, that's you're going to miss a lot of things. And so the last thing that we wanted to know is, what if we have people try and rate the actual articles themselves rather than the sources, which seems like a much harder problem because you need to have a lot more specific information. You're not sort of aggregating just up to the level of the source. You have to actually look at specific headlines. So what we did is we had some people at Facebook that were also interested in this crowdsourcing things. They gave us a set of articles that some sort of, this sort of state-of-the-art Facebook internal, is this misinformation or not, algorithm said, this stuff is sketchy and should get investigated. So this is like the kind of thing that a platform would want to get rated. And first, we hired 3 fact checkers to fact check, to read the whole article and do all detailed research and fact check each of these 209 articles. And then we also got a bunch of MTurkers to rate them. But instead of having them read the whole article, we just showed them the headline and the lead. So basically what you would get out of a Facebook post. A, because this is scalable, where asking people to do research takes a long time. And B, because it's actually not totally clear to me that research is going to help in a lot of these cases. So we want to just know, if you do the most scalable thing, just have people look at the headline and the lead, how well can they do? And rather than just saying, is this true or false, what we did for both the fact checkers and the MTurkers is we had them answer 7 questions, each of which was on a 1 to 7 scale, saying to what extent does this article describe an event that actually happened? To what extent is it accurate? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? Is it true? Is it written in an unbiased way? And is it objective? And then the idea is basically you ask the same question 7 ways and average the results, and it gives you a less noisy measure than if you just picked the best performing one. And I think something that was less obvious to me at the beginning of this project, but is now like a thing that I keep really coming back to, is that whether something is accurate or not is not a binary, well, this is true or it's false, and that's great. And it's not even a trinary, well, it's true or it's misleading or it's false, but it exists on a continuum. And so it's important when you're thinking about evaluating stories to think about it in that kind of continuous way. So we get all these ratings, and then what we want to know about is what's the correlation between the average layperson ratings from just reading the headline and the average fact checker rating from going and researching the whole article. So how correlated are they? And then we also, because we want to see how scalable is this, say you get a really high correlation, but you need 10,000 lay people to rate every story, that's not going to work. And so the question is, how does the correlation between the lay people and the fact checkers vary with the number of lay people that you have rating each headline, which we sort of estimate using bootstrapping simulations. And we're going to look at it for a politically balanced layperson rating, and then just sort of for, because it's interesting, what happens if you split up and look at Democrats and Republicans separately. And so what you see is that if you have only 2 people rating each headline, there is very little correlation between the lay people and the fact checkers. But as the number of lay people increases, pretty quickly you get like an increase in the correlation and a leveling off for the, and also you see, as you might expect based on everything that I showed you beforehand and what you know about the current state of the world, the correlation between the Democrats and the fact checkers was substantially higher than the correlation between the Republicans and the fact checkers. But be that as it may, this sort of politically balanced rating performs pretty much as well as the Democrats, and it gives you a correlation in the best case of around 0.65. And so now the question is that good? Like, is that good enough for us to say, great, this seems useful, or not? And our initial feeling was like, that's not great. I mean, for a psychology experiment, a correlation of 0.65 is good. But if you're trying to make real assessments about what's good quantity, what's good content or not, that's not very good. But then we thought about, well, wait, that's sort of the numerator, but what's the right denominator? Like, what should you be comparing that to? And so that was part of what motivated us to get 3 fact checkers rating each article rather than just 1 fact checker. We wanted to know what was the level of inter-fact checker agreement. And so if you do this same analysis and say just what's the correlation between the ratings of the 3 fact checkers, it's 0.62. So that means that like at about 20 lay people just reading the headline and the lead, not even researching the article, they're as correlated with the fact checkers as the fact checkers are correlated amongst themselves going out and doing research on it. And part of this is because there are like legitimate disagreements amongst the fact checkers. So for our 3 fact checkers, this is sort of showing you the same. This is the plot I just showed you of looking about how the lay people relate to the average of the fact checkers. And now this is splitting it out just for the 3 in separate fact checkers. And so for fact checker number 1 and fact checker number 2, it looks pretty similar to the average. But for fact checker 3, the Republicans are actually more correlated with fact checker 3 than the Democrats. And we sort of did a bunch of sort of giving them test cases and being like, what do you think about this? And there were like, something on the order of like a fifth of the cases where this fact checker disagreed with these ones. And we basically were like, hey, what's the deal? And he gave these really long responses being like, I stand by my ratings. And the logic that he gave was reasonable. Basically, my feeling about it is he was being sort of pedantic and like extremely like nitpicky, but like not wrong in the sense that or let's say it was clearly reasoned and defensible. It wasn't like he was just saying, well, I like this, so it's true. And so I think that the point is there are different ways, even for people that have a lot of experience in this, in deciding what's true and what's not. And so that's something that that should really sort of keep in mind when thinking about all of this, is that on the one hand, there's not a clear-cut, well, this is true and this isn't. But on the other hand, there is real signal. And there is, even across these fact checkers, there was a reasonable amount of agreement on there's some stuff that really is not good. And so my sort of take-home from all of this is like accuracy writ large is a construct that exists. It's a continuous construct. And by getting a reasonable, not that large number of lay people to do estimates, you can come up with a pretty good rating of the quality of the content. And I guess the very last thing I'll say is you could also use these article level ratings as a way to create source level ratings. If you're worried about doing ratings at the level of the source because of this familiarity issue where people say they don't trust things they're not familiar about, you can create source level ratings by just averaging the ratings of all of the headlines that people rate from those sources. And part of what that would do, if platforms were to implement that, is it would incentivize outlets to create headlines that seemed plausible on reading, which I think would be a good thing. Essentially, I think it would disincentivize clickbait and sensationalism. And I think if people wrote plausible fake news, no one would ever share it. And like a lot of what makes the misinformation spread is that it's crazy and sort of sensational seeming. And so if you can create incentives to get the headlines more reasonable, I think that would lead to good outcomes. Okay, so just to summarize, I think that relying on professional fact checkers to fact check things is not a long-run solution. And I think that our studies suggest that lay people actually are surprisingly good at assessing the quality of information if they bother to pay attention. And so one feature of that means that if you make accuracy salient and get them to think about it, they get more discerning in their sharing. And also, crowdsourcing is surprisingly effective at identifying both low-quality sites and low-quality articles. And so what these things suggest is scalable solutions that don't rely on a centralized authority deciding what to censor. The accuracy thing is basically getting people to censor themselves, and the crowdsourcing is sort of letting the crowd make some decisions. And I should also say, I feel like in thinking about misinformation, there's no silver bullet. And I'm saying none of these, when you say solution, what I mean is a thing that people can have in their toolkit as part of an integrated solution. But a major caveat that I should give to literally everything that I said today is that we tested it all in the US. And we've done the sort of accuracy salient survey experiments in Italy, France, and Canada, and the UK, which are like very slightly not the US. But I think checking how these things work, particularly in places that don't have traditions of free press or any kind of media literacy or basic education, is super important. And I think also part of the cross-cultural issue is to think about in the crowdsourcing context. In the US, the sort of, at least when you're thinking about politics, the two dominant groups are roughly equally powerful. But I think you need to think about how do you get these mechanisms to work in places where you don't want a sort of majority to be able to say lies about the minority are true. And I think there are various approaches to that that are getting thought about, but just flagging that as another major issue. Okay, so thanks. As I said, all of this is with Gord, and then these other great people in or associated with my research group worked on various of the other projects. And thanks to the people that gave us some money, and thanks to all of you.
Question, I just want to know if you encountered this organization called NewsGuard and what they're doing, and maybe you could describe it to people. I'm trying to see where that fits in the continuum of what you're talking about, where they are not trying to check facts of a story, but grade the reliability of the sources of the stories.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think of NewsGuard as generally in the source salience or source information category of like, it's providing information about how much you should trust this source. And I think this sort of same story applies there, where that could have an impact on how people, the extent to which people believe things when that information is mismatched with what they would get just from reading the headline by itself. And our analysis suggests that for most of the content that's doing well out there, there's not actually that much of a mismatch. And so I feel like I'm less enthusiastic about that than I am about other things, except in so much as providing that accuracy information and those sort of ratings might just get people to think about the concept of accuracy more generally. And so that could be good, but that's sort of, I think, not really why they're doing it.
On the experiment with the DMs and the accuracy, have you noticed change from the first day to the third day on that segment that you had done it? As in, how much does the DM? How big is the recency effect?
We don't really have enough statistical power to say much credible past the first day, because the disadvantage of this stepped wedge effect, like design, is the further out you go, the less of a control condition you have to compare it to. So basically, in these experiments that were ran, we're not powered to answer that question. But it's clearly a super important thing to know when trying to actually implement this.
So I had a question about the experiment you did with the Breitbart followers, and I think you showed the scale of 0.04 to minus 0.04 and how likely they would be to change what they would share. So I was just wondering with this, given that like 0.02 minus 0.02 seems like a very small figure in terms of the percentage, so would that be statistically significant at this level, and if you were to scale it?
This is where I'm saying, like, in order to contextualize what do these words mean, you can think about, so first of all, there's two different things. There's statistical significance and there's kind of practical significance, right? And so if you have a really large sample, you can have an extremely precisely estimated, so it's very statistically significant, but essentially meaningless effect. And so this is the plot for the statistical significance part. Like, it's definitely statistically significant. And so then the question is it practically significant? And the way that I think about thinking about what is, like, how do you interpret these numbers is you can think about, like, what's this increase in the average quality of what's happened. And so we get an effect that's, it's around a 5% increase. And there's this question of, like, how important is that? And I think when you think about the effect size estimates, there are important things to keep in mind. The first one is that this is likely a dramatic underestimate of the true effect size for a few different reasons. One thing is we say the minute we send the message, we start counting everything for the next 24 hours is treated. And everything, but we don't know when they see the message. We don't even know if they see the message at all. So it's presumably a good chunk of our subjects never even get the message, but they're all included in there as treated. And another thing is that, as I mentioned, the design is just the first random thing that I thought of, and I'm not much of a graphic designer. Like, all of my graphic design skills are from making albums for my punk band when I was in high school. So like, the hope is by doing better design, you can make more effective stimuli that can create a bigger effect. And I guess the third point also is to think about network effects, which is if you get this person that you send the treatment to reduce their sharing by a bit, it also means that all of their followers are exposed to a bit less, which also means their followers are a bit less likely to share the things that they were supposed to, and their followers, and so on. So there are potentially ways where these translate into bigger effects. So like I said, I don't think this one thing is going to solve the entire problem, but it seems like could be useful.
It looked like the Republicans have a real problem with not trusting anything.
Yes.
And but that seemed worth of a big follow-up, because you have a big chunk of the country that doesn't trust anything that they're seeing. And that would seem to have some correlation to problems with sharing false information if you don't believe there's any source that's reliable. Mm-hmm. But that's not actually the point.
To one side comment on that, which is we actually fairly consistently find over the studies that we run where we have people rate the accuracy of specific headlines, which we've run like 1 million of these studies at this point. We don't find that the Republicans are more likely to believe false stories, but we do find that Republicans are pretty consistently less likely to believe true stories,
right.
Which is consistent with this, which is probably a bigger problem, honestly.
I think there's a big, interesting story in there. But the piece I want to get some more clarity on is how you see the relationship between perceived accuracy of a story that one is seeing, particularly without a source, and actual factuality. Because basically, perceived accuracy is just something that is my prediction based on my knowledge of the world up to now of what could plausibly be true. But you could have a Markov model that just took the news and could keep generating plausible news, none of which is true, but it could all be plausible. And that's kind of what you're asking people to rate is this story plausibly true? And then the fact checkers actually go and check the facts.
Right.
The important part for a lot of news, and particularly when you're looking at sources, is that interesting news are the things that you wouldn't think are plausible because they're a novel event in some way. So 2 weeks ago, if you said, the Speaker of the House is going to come to the State of the Union address and rip the thing up and basically throw it at the president. Is that plausible? There's a good reason to say, no, that's not a very plausible story. It happens to be factually true. And so my question is, and then when you say that the sources, it's when something is a mismatch, that would seem to be exactly when you need the source.
Right.
And so I'm having a little trouble understanding how you're equating factuality and plausibility.
Right. So I think there's a few different things in there. So one is that we are having people rate essentially plausibility. that like I agree that that's the central DV in most of what we're measuring, other than the sharing studies, is how plausible do you think this thing is? And I guess one of the results that comes out is that that's pretty reasonably related to how true it actually turns out to be. That is, like, plausibility is a reasonably good proxy. Yeah.
Things that in some ways aren't used because you could have predicted them.
Yeah, and then in terms of the surprising things, so I think that there's sort of two in this diagram. There's like these two places where you get some kind of mismatch. My sense is in the misinformation, disinformation discussion, the focus is mostly on stuff that is plausible, but from a bad source. And that is the things that people would fall for, but if they get reminded it's from a bad source, then they say, okay, maybe I shouldn't fall for that.
Like Pizzagate, totally plausible.
Right, exactly. So then that would be down here, right? But I think then the issue that you're raising, with like the speaker ripping up the I blocked it out, the State of the Union is down here, where it's an implausible headline, but it's from a credible source.
It's not just a credible source, it's also factually.
Well, yeah, that's true. Okay, fine. But anyways, the point is, so for that stuff, the source is useful, but like there's not much of that. And I guess maybe the other comment that I would say is that I think that although that is also interesting and important, that's not the misinformation. I think that's sort of in the same category of the first observation of yours of people not believing things that are true, which is also an important thing to be talking about. But my sense is, at least most of what we've been focusing on is people believing things that aren't true, which is the sort of converse. And it's interesting to think the extent to which those are different problems.
I'm curious about, so these are, everything that seems to be in this study is a formalized news source in the sense that it's presenting itself in some way as that, but it seems like one of the other disturbing trends we have is kind of below the surface, like the forums, the kind of drawing connections between things that may not necessarily be there and can reach some of these other sources. So I'm curious if you've studied some of the non-formal news sources online.
We haven't, and I think that's a super interesting and important direction. And something else sort of in that vein is like memes, and just like tweets and stuff like that. And there's sorts of, like some guy says something on Twitter, and then that's news. So basically, we haven't got there yet, but I think that's super interesting and important.
So can you give us like a simple overview on the internet regulations that aim to solve this problem?
No. Sorry, that's not my area of expertise. Basically, my sense is nothing. Maybe is yet, but people are talking about things. But I don't know. There are legal people here that know much more about those things than I. But that's not. I'm sorry. That's.
I just know this is a fairly new project, so that's
right.
why I wasn't sure.
Yeah, my sense is there's not much regulation yet, and the social media companies. Well, I don't know. Either they are scared of it or they want it, depending on.
And I'm working on a project around deepfakes at the moment, and wondered if any of your research could be translated to, cheap fake videos, deepfakes, and what you thought kind of good techniques for spreading misinformation of that kind of video content could be. We
actually have a project on deepfakes, which originated from the question of how do you, fight deepfakes. But we were like, before we start thinking about that, the more fundamental question is how much should we actually be worried about deepfakes? And there's a lot of different dimensions of that, but the one that we looked at is, I think the sort of deepfake panic or even cheap fake panic is premised on the idea that video is a lot more compelling and persuasive than text. And although there is a bunch of stuff in the comm literature on comparing modalities, there's it's kind of all over the place, and there isn't that much looking at political stuff in particular. So with Adam Berinsky and a couple of graduate students, we have a paper that we just submitted today. So it will be rejected tomorrow, and then we'll post it as a working paper on Friday. That basically takes some videos, either play the video or have them read text, and randomize across stories whether you see it as video or text, and then ask, how much do you believe that the thing described actually happened, and how convinced by, like basically some measure of how persuaded are you by it. And what we find is across both political and non-political content, people are very slightly more likely to believe that things actually happened when they're shown with video versus text. And because we have a big sample size, we're able to precisely estimate it, and it's a tiny effect. And then when you look at the actual persuasion part, there is a tiny positive, persuasive effect of video over text for commercial stuff, like stain removers and Gwyneth Paltrow saying you should use oil of oregano when you get sick or whatever. But there was totally zero persuasive advantage of video over text for any of the political things that we looked at. And so we have to see how this generalizes to a wider range of content and all of that, but I think the basic message is maybe people shouldn't be so freaked out about deepfakes relative to other kinds of misinformation as they are. So that's a long answer, but also any of this stuff should work for deepfakes. Probably. I mean, because basically my feeling is it's just another form of misinformation.
If there were some sort of public-facing score for users on Facebook, and they were getting feedback on how accurate the things that they were sharing were, whether that was sourced through crowdsourcing or professional fact checkers, and based off some subsample of what they're able to score, do you think that people would care and respond to that? Do you think that they would basically just discount any negative feedback they got based on, I don't know, justification or disagreement with the fact checker? Do you have any data, or do you have any sense of whether that would be effective or not?
Yeah, I don't know. So I feel like most times that I give this talk, the idea of some kind of like badging or essentially shaming reputation system kind of thing comes up. I'm overall sort of skeptical of it, both because I'm worried about some of the reactance kind of things that you're talking about, where people, particularly problem people, will wear it as a badge of honor to have a bad reputation, but also just I think people will hate it, and that will make it kind of infeasible. And so we haven't really looked into that, but we are starting to discuss, in general, the idea of giving people feedback, which could be public or it could be private, and sort of wondering like what is effective feedback in terms of the things you're saying. Is it from fact checkers, from the crowd, from people like you, and things like that. And so it's sort of something. It was not the first place we went, but it is something that we are sort of looking into now.
I have a quick question about stratification of the content of what you are showing to people. As we're looking at misinformation in health, we're talking a lot about entrenched issues versus your sort of latest misinformation or conspiracy theory of the day, which is a lot easier to debunk than people's beliefs about vaccines. So have you experimented a bit with what you're putting in front of people, or is that a possibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so we have mostly been focused on things that are in the latter category you're saying, of things that are not a sort of another piece of evidence for a deeply entrenched belief, but rather these sort of pieces of evidence, of like sort of new novel evidence. And I agree that I think the problem is a lot harder for deeply entrenched issues, not just because of motivated reasoning, that is people wanting to defend their prior commitments in some kind of motivated way, but also just from a pure sort of rational, if you're trying to have maximally accurate beliefs, if there's some uncertainty about the reliability of information sources, which is always true, it's actually sort of Bayesian, optimal, rational to say, how well does this align with my priors? And if it's totally not aligned with my priors, the source is probably crap rather than everything I know about the world is wrong. And so that is also, I think, in the category of things that we haven't started on yet, but that are very interested in, like health misinformation in particular. So, next year.
I've just got a quick methodological sidebar. Did your work on Twitter break the Twitter terms of service, or did you even think about that?
We did actually think about it, and although I think a major methodological obstacle, in fact, the thing that took essentially all of the time in doing that experiment was figuring out how to avoid getting blocked by Twitter. We sort of, it was blocked not for violating terms of service, but for just like them not liking us. That is, there's a difference between the terms of service and saying, oh, you look spammy. So no, I don't think it violates the terms of service.
We're great talk. We're very interested in the public's trust in science in particular. And I was wondering, I didn't see whether you made a distinction between specifically political stories and versus non-political stories, and in particular, the previous question asker was saying if there is this less belief in trusted sources, is that mostly for the political news, or does that go across the board? So in other words, does this also affect, for instance, stories that have scientific backing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we really focused on political content here, and so that's another one where like health misinformation and sort of science, both misinformation and information, are areas that we think are really interesting and that we haven't looked at except in so much as they kind of intersect with political news. And so the one sort of science-related things I can say is in our experiment where we show people, we have them rate the accuracy of one headline at the beginning and then have them make more discerning in their sharing of political content. We tried a bunch of different stories at the beginning, and the one that we found that was the most effective was actually like a science, scientists discover some new subatomic particle or something like that, or some new galaxy, or I forget what it was, something along those lines. But they felt like it sort of, and even for both Republicans and Democrats, that was particularly effective at getting them to think about accuracy, which is a different question. But I think, and Dan Kahan has done work in this where it's sort of like the thing that seems to most sort of protect against these false beliefs is kind of curiosity about science, more so than science knowledge, which is not really an answer to your question, but is, in there.
I wanted to know whether you have considered or might consider in the future in the surveys, are you testing for more than just the political orientation? For example, the analytical skills or something related to, just with the hope that there might be something even more in the root of the problem, that if we educate people more in an analytical, logical way, they might have a better judgment of not trusting fake news.
Yes, totally. So that's actually where we started with all of this before we got into evaluating interventions, is looking at analytical skills. And the basic result is more analytical thinking, less belief in fake news, less belief in hyperpartisan news, regardless of whether it aligns with your ideology or not, which actually was counter to a lot of the narratives, because a lot of the narrative out there is your reasoning abilities are held captive by your partisanship. And so if you think more, you're just going to talk yourself into believing all the crazy stuff. We totally didn't find that. So people that engage in more thinking are less likely to believe false stuff. And also experimentally, if you kind of distract people and make people do less thinking, they're more likely to believe false claims, not more likely to believe true claims. And if then you give them a chance to think about it, it makes their, basically thinking actually causes reduced belief in false claims. So critical thinking is good. Let's all do it.
So towards the end, as you were showing some of the newer work, you are using and leveraging the systematic asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans in terms of trust patterns. Do you have the data to go in, particularly for your intervention of the accuracy priming, to go in and see what the displacement is? Because if you're moving people from accurate stories on Breitbart to accurate stories on Fox News, maybe it doesn't matter. If you're moving them from inaccurate stories on Breitbart to inaccurate stories on Fox News, and you're actually prompting them to increase the accuracy assessments of their network, you could actually have a bad outcome in terms of the network diffusion. And you probably know, you can probably assess, at least at the scales you've been describing, what the displacement effect that the prime does.
It's a great question, and the problem basically is, like, as David's group and other groups in the space have done, everything, we're doing all the classification at the level of the source rather than the level of the article, because there's just too many articles. So like in the Twitter experiment, there's like 1.1 million tweets that are in the data set. And I just don't know, and there's no good classifiers. So you can't just say, oh, well, we just put in the is this true or not classifier, and it sorts it out. And so I think I would really like to know the answer to that question, and I just sort of don't really know of a feasible way of getting are these good claims or not ratings on a million tweets. But if you have ideas.
Okay,
Yeah.
we are at 1:30, so I'm afraid we're out of time. But let's thank our speaker.
Thanks all so much.